What if entire royal families did not fall in battle, were not overthrown by revolutions, and yet still vanished from history? What if power did not disappear, but simply changed its name, its shape, and its visibility? And what if what we call modern governance was built not on the ruins of empires, but on something quietly erased? Before we go any further, ask yourself this: how many ruling houses can disappear without a single official declaration of collapse? And why do we almost never ask that question? If you find this topic intriguing, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write a comment sharing whether you believe power can exist without being publicly recognized. Your perspective matters more than you think. Between 1760 and 1840, a vast region historically referred to as Tartary underwent a transformation unlike any other recorded political shift. There were no decisive wars marking its end, no grand treaties announcing its defeat, no iconic moment that history books point to as the fall of a civilization. Instead, something far quieter occurred. The royal houses that structured authority across this immense territory began to dissolve one by one, without spectacle, without funerals, and without successors officially recorded. These were not monarchies as modern audiences imagine them. There were no universally recognized crowns, no standardized coats of arms, no palaces designed to impress the public eye. Authority operated through lineage administration and regional command, often embedded within trade networks, land management, and spiritual stewardship. Power was real, exercised daily, yet rarely documented in a centralized form. What makes this period unusual is not that political systems changed, but how thoroughly the names behind those systems vanished. Family lines that governed for generations simply stopped appearing in records. Titles became vague. Leadership roles were redefined. Local rulers became administrators. Administrators became civil servants. And over time, memory itself adjusted to the new vocabulary. Official history describes this era as one of modernization and rational governance. Feudal remnants were supposedly replaced by efficient bureaucracies. But this explanation raises uncomfortable questions. Why were the former ruling families not absorbed into the new systems as noble houses, as happened elsewhere? Why do genealogical records abruptly end? And why do architectural, economic, and logistical systems continue uninterrupted, as if authority never truly changed hands? In many regions formerly attributed to Tartary, maps were redrawn repeatedly within a few decades. Names of territories shifted, borders softened, then hardened again. What had once been described as autonomous zones became provinces, then districts, then abstract administrative units. The human element behind governance faded, replaced by offices rather than individuals. Some researchers argue this was a natural evolution. Others suggest something more deliberate. When power structures are preserved but identities are removed, control becomes harder to trace. Accountability dissolves. Authority appears impersonal, inevitable, almost natural. And when no one remembers who ruled before, no one asks who benefits now. There is also the question of documentation. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were not a dark age of record-keeping. On the contrary, this was a period obsessed with cataloging, classifying, and standardizing knowledge. Entire populations were counted, taxed, and registered. And yet, royal households across vast territories left almost no trace of formal dissolution. No exile records, no trials, no public abdications. Instead, they simply stopped being mentioned. Was this the result of deliberate archival cleansing? Or did the transition happen so gradually that it left no moment dramatic enough to record? And if it was gradual, who designed the process? What is certain is that by the mid-19th century, Tartary no longer existed as a political reality, yet its infrastructure remained active. Trade routes continued, cities functioned, laws were enforced, power did not collapse. It reorganized itself behind new terminology, and that raises a final question for now. If authority can survive while its rulers disappear from memory, how many other power structures in history have done the same? The answer to that may lie in what happened next. As standardized governments expanded, education systems rewrote narratives, and the last traces of unnamed royal houses faded from public consciousness. As the 19th century advanced, the disappearance of Tartary from official narratives became increasingly precise. What had once been described as a vast, loosely unified system of governance was now fragmented into manageable units, each with its own administrative identity. This was not presented as destruction, but as clarification, not as loss, but as progress. Education played a decisive role. New curricula introduced standardized historical timelines that reframed the past as a sequence of inevitable evolutions. Tartary was reduced from a functioning power structure to a vague geographic reference, often portrayed as a misunderstood or exaggerated concept from outdated maps. Students learned names of empires that rose and fell dramatically, but Tartary was treated as something that simply faded away, requiring no explanation. This absence is revealing. Civilizations that collapse violently leave scars in the historical record. Refugee movements, economic disruption, cultural trauma. Yet across regions once attributed to Tartarian administration, daily life appears remarkably stable during the transition period. Cities did not empty. Markets did not collapse. Roads, canals, and supply chains remained operational. Something continued to coordinate them. Instead of kings and dynasties, authority began to appear as offices, councils, and committees. Power was no longer inherited publicly, but assigned through procedures. Titles that once indicated lineage were replaced with functional labels: governor, inspector, magistrate. These roles sounded temporary, neutral, interchangeable. And that may have been the point. When leadership becomes abstract, resistance becomes difficult. You cannot overthrow a system that presents itself as inevitable. You cannot rebel against an office that claims no personal ambition. And when names disappear, responsibility dissolves into procedure. Architectural evidence complicates the narrative even further. Across former Tartarian territories, massive administrative buildings appear during this period with no clear attribution. They are described as government halls, depots, or civic centers, yet their scale often exceeds the needs of newly formed administrations. These structures suggest continuity of centralized coordination rather than spontaneous local governance. Why would emerging bureaucracies require buildings designed for far more complex command systems? And who financed their construction during supposedly transitional years? Some historians argue these buildings were inherited. Others suggest they were repurposed remnants of an earlier system. But official explanations rarely address who originally commissioned them or under what authority. The buildings exist, functional and imposing, but detached from any acknowledged lineage. The same pattern appears in legal systems. Laws implemented during this era often claim to be reforms, yet many are refinements rather than replacements. Terminology changes, but principles remain. Jurisdictional authority persists, merely rebranded. This continuity implies that power did not need to reinvent itself. It simply adapted its presentation. There is also the issue of language. Older documents reference terms that later translations smooth out or remove entirely. Words associated with stewardship, custodianship, or collective mandate are replaced with modern bureaucratic phrasing. Meaning shifts subtly, guiding interpretation away from inherited authority toward institutional legitimacy. Was this linguistic evolution organic or intentional? Critics of alternative interpretations argue that no conspiracy is necessary. They claim this was the natural outcome of modernization. But this explanation assumes that entire ruling classes voluntarily dissolved without resistance, compensation, or record. It assumes silence, where history usually records conflict, and silence, when consistent, is rarely accidental. By the time centralized nation-states solidified their borders, the memory of Tartarian royal houses had already thinned beyond recovery. Without names, there could be no heirs. Without heirs, no claims. Without claims, no questions. What remained was structure without story. And that structure, now embedded in modern administrations, would soon be reinforced by another powerful force: global standardization of knowledge itself, ensuring that future generations would never think to ask what existed before. The reinforcement of this new historical framework did not rely solely on borders and laws. It depended on something far more durable: the standardization of knowledge itself. During the 19th century, international agreements on education, cartography, science, and administration quietly aligned how the world would describe reality. Once these standards were in place, alternative interpretations no longer vanished through force but through irrelevance. Maps offer one of the clearest examples. Earlier cartographic records frequently depicted Tartary as a vast, organized entity, often subdivided into regions with distinct administrative identities. Yet within a few generations, these maps were reclassified as speculative, inaccurate, or symbolic. New additions simplified the landscape, replacing complex structures with neutral geography. Mountains remained, rivers remained, but governance disappeared. This shift was subtle. Rather than declaring previous maps false, institutions framed them as products of misunderstanding. Explorers were said to have exaggerated. Cartographers were described as misinformed. The implication was clear. No correction was necessary, because there had never been anything real to correct. But this explanation struggles to account for consistency. Independent maps from different regions, created decades apart, often describe Tartary with similar proportions and internal divisions. Coincidence is possible. Systematic coincidence is harder to defend. The same erasure appears in economic records. Trade flows across Eurasia did not suddenly emerge with modern nation-states. They pre-existed them. Tariff systems, storage networks, and logistical hubs functioned with remarkable coordination long before centralized governments claimed authority over them. Yet when the narrative was rewritten, these systems were attributed to spontaneous commercial growth rather than inherited infrastructure. Power, in this version of history, becomes an abstract force. It has no ancestors. Archives further complicate the story. In multiple regions, records from the late 18th century show abrupt gaps. Documents referencing regional authority stop mid-sequence. Successions are left unresolved. Names appear once, then never again. No explanation is provided. Later archivists annotate these absences as lost, damaged, or irrelevant, but loss usually leaves traces: fires, floods, wars. Here, there is often nothing, just silence. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. If you remove enough names from history, you do not need to destroy the system they built. You inherit it. Without lineage, power becomes ownerless, free to be claimed by whoever defines legitimacy next. Some researchers describe this process as administrative assimilation rather than conquest. Instead of overthrowing Tartarian authority, emerging governments absorbed its mechanisms. The difference lay in presentation. Authority was no longer justified by continuity, but by rational necessity. It was not inherited, it was required. And once authority is framed as necessary, questioning its origin feels pointless. There is also the matter of symbolism. Older Tartarian structures often lacked overt displays of monarchy. This absence, once practical, later became convenient. Without crowns or thrones to point to, later historians could argue that no real ruling class existed at all. Power without spectacle is easy to deny, yet power does not require performance to function. As the 19th century drew to a close, public consciousness fully adjusted. Tartary became a footnote, then a curiosity, then a dismissed anomaly. To question its political reality was framed as misunderstanding history rather than re-examining it. And once something is labeled confusion, discussion ends. But confusion can also be manufactured. What remains unresolved is not whether Tartary existed as described in older records, but why its governing identities were the only elements deemed unnecessary to preserve. Geography was saved. Architecture was reused. Systems were maintained. Only the families disappeared. What followed was not an abrupt decision, but a gradual consolidation of authority over interpretation itself. By the late 19th century, historical legitimacy increasingly depended on institutional approval. Universities, national archives, and state-sponsored academies became the gatekeepers of what was considered valid knowledge. History was no longer just recorded, it was curated. This shift mattered because it redefined absence as insignificance. If a dynasty left no officially recognized documentation, it could be dismissed as legend. If a governing system lacked standardized symbols, it could be reclassified as informal or imaginary. Tartary, stripped of its royal houses, fit perfectly into this new framework of dismissal. The process did not require falsification. It relied on selection. Certain documents were emphasized, others were deprioritized. Context was narrowed. Over time, repetition replaced debate. Once enough textbooks echoed the same simplified narrative, complexity itself began to feel suspicious. This is how erasure stabilizes, not through destruction, but through normalization. Legal continuity provides another revealing detail. In many former Tartarian regions, modern legal codes were not written from nothing. They evolved from existing practices. Land rights, taxation principles, and administrative divisions often mirrored older systems almost exactly, differing mainly in terminology. The authority enforcing these rules changed its justification, not its function. This continuity suggests inheritance without acknowledgement. Even ceremonial transitions were conspicuously absent. Where monarchies dissolved elsewhere, history records coronations, abdications, or executions. Here there is none of that. Power did not change hands in public. It simply stopped being personified. Some argue this reflects a peaceful evolution, but peaceful transitions still generate documentation. Agreements are signed. Authority is transferred. Yet the disappearance of Tartarian royal houses lacks any such paper trail. Another layer emerges when examining population records. Census systems expanded dramatically during this era, categorizing people by profession, residence, and economic role. Individuals became data points. Social identity replaced familial allegiance. This shift reduced the relevance of lineage, making royal descent increasingly invisible within administrative logic. When society stops tracking lineage, ruling families become indistinguishable from the population they govern. This change also altered loyalty. Allegiance shifted from persons to systems, from families to flags, from inherited stewardship to abstract nationhood. In that environment, remembering who ruled before becomes unnecessary, even inconvenient. A subtle question remains unanswered. If Tartarian authority was as disorganized or mythical as modern narratives suggest, why was so much effort invested in redefining it rather than simply ignoring it? Why were maps revised, terms reinterpreted, and references softened instead of erased entirely? Selective memory implies intent. By the early 20th century, the transformation was complete. Tartary existed only as a historical curiosity, stripped of political agency. Its royal houses were gone, not defeated, not absorbed, just forgotten. And with them vanished any alternative model of power that did not rely on visible monarchy or declared sovereignty. What endured was a world where authority presented itself as faceless, procedural, and unquestionable, detached from ancestry and therefore from challenge. And once power no longer needs a past, it no longer needs consent based on memory. That realization opens a final and uncomfortable line of inquiry, one that leads directly into the closing phase of this investigation, where the consequences of this erasure become impossible to ignore. When power no longer carries memory, it becomes almost impossible to challenge. That may be the most enduring consequence of the Tartarian erasure. By removing royal houses from the historical record, authority was transformed into something abstract, permanent, and impersonal. For it no longer belonged to families, traditions, or identifiable lineages. It belonged to systems, and systems once normalized rarely feel optional. Modern governance inherited more from Tartary than it admits. Centralized logistics, layered administration, regional autonomy under a unified framework, and long-distance coordination did not emerge suddenly in the 19th century. They were already functioning. What changed was not capability, but narrative ownership. Without former rulers to reference, modern institutions could present themselves as origin points rather than successors. This reframing created the illusion of progress without precedent, making centralized authority appear as a rational necessity rather than a continuation of inherited power. The disappearance of Tartarian royal houses also removed an alternative model of legitimacy. These families ruled without theatrical sovereignty. Their authority did not depend on spectacle or constant public affirmation. In a modern context, such quiet power is dangerous because it suggests governance does not require national identity, ideology, or visible hierarchy. That idea conflicts directly with how modern states justify themselves. Once erased, Tartary could be redefined at will. It could be minimized, mythologized, or dismissed entirely. And because no recognized heirs remained, no one could formally dispute those interpretations. Silence became proof of non-existence. This pattern did not end in the 19th century. It became a template. Throughout modern history, power structures have repeatedly detached themselves from identifiable origins. Corporations, financial systems, supranational institutions, and regulatory bodies often operate with immense influence while presenting themselves as neutral mechanisms rather than inherited authority. The Tartarian case may represent an early example of this transition, where power survived by abandoning identity. The question then shifts from whether Tartary existed to why its disappearance was so complete. Empires fall, but they are remembered. Dynasties collapse, but their names remain. Here memory itself was dismantled, and memory, once removed, is difficult to restore. This does not require a single coordinated conspiracy. It requires alignment of incentives. Bureaucracies benefit from anonymity. Institutions benefit from continuity without attribution. Education systems benefit from simplified narratives. Over time, these forces reinforce one another until absence feels natural, but natural does not mean accidental. If power today appears untouchable, faceless, and inevitable, it may be because it learned long ago how to survive without being seen. Tartary's royal houses did not lose power in battle. They lost visibility, and visibility, once gone, rarely returns on its own. The final question is not about the past, but about the present. How many modern power structures operate without a clear lineage? How many systems claim authority without acknowledging inheritance? And how often does history teach us what to remember by first deciding what must be forgotten? If Tartary's rulers were erased to make power untraceable, then the story is not finished. It is ongoing. And understanding that may be the first step toward recognizing how authority truly functions in the world we live in today.